All right. Hello. Good morning. So finally, like I was just gonna do a stream now, and then I saw creating a stream from the app I'm using. I'm using Ecamm. It's actually really, really good. And there's an additional options there. So now we're streaming in the correct resolution with low latency. I guess, yeah, so it doesn't do 4K, but that doesn't matter. You don't need 4K for this content. So okay. So yeah, I feel really good about the impact now. We did this like pivot last week, more of like a forced change of perspective to see if we could identify. Like it's really hard. I think one general thing I learned about this is that when you have a challenge related to increased complexity, whatever that increased complexity means in practice. Like the problem doesn't occur until you reach a certain level of complexity. It's really difficult to find the root cause of that. And doing this pivot last week, it just made it more like I kind of had this intuition about what was the problem, but I wasn't able to explain it very well. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do now, is to create this like template for a presentation, because what I've also learned through open source is that you have the same thing as like product development. You have early adopters, you have people who's just very satisfied and never says anything, and then you have people who are super satisfied and is part of the community. Some people even become maintainers, and then you have people that just hates the idea, rightfully so. You have people who hates the idea unrightfully so. So what I want to do here is try to give some tools for people who does adopt it early, and kind of get why it's different, to have some tools to explain to other people their own experience with it. And a presentation template is a good way to do that. And maybe like try to start up. I asked ChatGPT, how should I do this release in conjunction with React 19 and all this stuff. But yeah, maybe we should start a Discord channel. Anyways, doesn't matter. We'll figure it out. But I thought I would kind of go through where I'm at with this template. Like I haven't styled it completely yet. But the point is to talk about complex state management, because this stuff doesn't matter if you don't have complexity in your state management. And even I'm not sure if it even makes sense to use impact for anything but single page applications, because they're very much tied together, like complexity of state management and doing a single page application. It's like having this native feel to it. Yeah, so what I'm not sure about the actual subtitle here, or I guess that's the title. But what I want to kind of state here is that even though there's this trend now where React is becoming a server-side rendered kind of experience or developer experience, where you have server-side components, there is still this class of applications where you don't want to do that. You want to bundle this JavaScript bundle. You want to open the client, and then this JavaScript bundle is what is your app. And this is very typical for editor kinds of experiences, where it's not about like like building up this UI lazily. You just want to load up the editor, probably using a service worker where you have cached all the JavaScript dependencies. It just instantly boots up. And when it does that, it also instantly reacts to any interactions in the UI. It never does anything lazily. Like doing server-side rendering is just too slow, regardless of how fast it is. And you don't care about the size. Like it's almost like you visit the app, you install the app just like you do from an app store, and then it runs from the browser. That is more the kind of thing you want to use something like Impact for. I should add that. Install. Think of it more as installing an app in the browser. The type of sorry for the text size here. I can't zoom. Well, I guess maybe I can go here and zoom. Yeah, look at that. Like the shortcut is, oh, can I do? Okay, I guess this helps a little bit. Where you install the app. Well, it was basically everything I just said. It's kind of yeah, where you install the app and run it natively from the browser. Yeah, I can expand on that later. Anyway, so what I want to do is first go and talk about reconciliation versus observation. And I think this is incredibly insightful. Well, incredibly, I'm blowing smoke up my ass. But I think this is useful framing regardless of impact. Because when you do reconciliation, sorry about the shitty code here. I'm going to use a tool to highlight and make it look nice. What the hell? But reconciliation is a mechanism that allows you to just use to express dynamic UI. That's important. So reconciliation allows you to write a function. You can give that function some dependencies to state, and you can use normal if statements, props items.map. You can map over items. You can use switch statements and whatever you want to express the dynamic nature of the UI. Right? This is a big thing in React, and I'm not sure to what extent people know why they stick with React. Like, it's an intuition that they stick with React, but I think this is the reason people stick with React. It's not about like suspense and server-side components, and even though they have some leading ideas that's adopted by other frameworks, the reason people stay with React is because of reconciliation, to express the dynamic nature of UIs. Because if you're gonna do this in other tools like Svelte or Vue or even Angular, you have to learn a template language. You have to learn these special things to express the dynamic nature of the UI. And it doesn't support typing, right? That's the whole thing about TypeScript, is that it's able to understand that when you return props.isAwesome here, if you're down here, it knows that isAwesome is false, right? You don't get that, and this is not important in this piece of UI, but with switch statements and like if statements in general, that it's important. Anyways, I think that's why people stick with React. But then you get to the state management. And as I express in the documentation, like the best possible way to introduce state in functional components is to use hooks, right? If you have this reconciler running, so hooks are good in that sense, but it's not really these primitives of state and management of state is not put there to do, how should I put this? So these primitives that was introduced with hooks like useState and useEffect, they're not there to do state management. They're there for state synchronization. So useEffect isn't to do data fetching and like do side effects. It's there to subscribe to something and return a disposer to unsubscribe from something. That's what it's designed for. But people use it for other things. And then it's just the whole concept of like defining state management in a function that's called again and again and again. Producing closures over time requires special primitives like useRef just to define a variable. It really isn't ideal. As I state strongly in the documentation, you would never introduce a reconciler to make state management a better developer experience. The reconciler is there for dynamic UIs. It's not there. It wasn't introduced for state management. But then we can look at observation. And what's really interesting about observation is that it's, like I can say it here, like it's really shitty when it comes to dynamic UIs. Because in an observation paradigm, if you define a component which returns a piece of UI, this function isn't called again. It's called once, which means that you need special primitives to handle things like all the dynamic nature. It being kind of trying to do an if statement or doing a switch statement, doing a for loop, anything that's like dynamic needs some kind of special thing. So here I'm trying not to like bash on Solid JS, because Solid is awesome. But this is the exact reason why we don't move away from React. It's because we don't want this. We just want to use if statements and for loops, or sorry, map over arrays, and do switch statements and get all the amazing typing that comes from that, because it's just JavaScript, right? But with observation, expressing dynamic UI, you're forced to having these kinds of things. But when it comes to expressing state management, suddenly everything changes. Because first of all, when you have observation primitives instead of reconciler primitives, you're not constrained to the components anymore. It doesn't matter if you define it in a component, in a context, or globally. Like you can define it anywhere you want and it will just work. But you can also do things like since there's no like, let's see, maybe I should yeah, that's not important. Since the function is not called multiple times, you are free to instantiate whatever you need. So the point is, since the function isn't called again and again, we can now fetch the data as part of creating this state store. And that means that you can even instantiate promises and make them observe. Maybe I'm doing too much here. Yeah, talking about this, I'm doing too much. But it is really amazing that now you're kind of freed from having this like multiple call to the function, so you can basically do whatever you want. So in this case, we were able to like move from like useEffect and all of this to just putting a promise in a signal, and then you have your data fetching there. And of course, here you can argue, yeah, but I could use React Query, for example. But that's still tied to the reconciliation loop of React. You can only use it inside React. Like you can't use React Query in Redux, for example, or MobX. Yeah, I need to think about this one. But the point of these slides is that we kind of get to this conclusion together that UI is best expressed with reconciliation and state is best expressed with observation. Yeah, even that sounds a bit weird. I have to see what we're gonna do with that. How do I? There we go. Yeah. So that's like one thing I wanna, because I want these kinds of presentations to be, even though it's in the context of impact and it's kind of selling impact, the point is to dig into what are we actually doing and where are our pain points and friction points and try to understand them. And the trade-offs we're making, what do they mean in practice, and all of this. That's kind of the primary message. And then it's like, oh, by the way, you have this thing called impact that's trying to resolve these itches and challenges. So that's kind of the first part. And then the second part is local versus context versus global, where when you have, but now we're kind of switching to observation. So I'm not making that very. Now let us explore state observation in different React scopes, in different. Well, it's not strictly React scopes. In different scopes of React application. Yeah. So first you have like a local scope. And in a local scope, in a component scope, like we're still tied to the reconciliation loop of React. There's no way around that, right? So looking at this example of like use signal, it doesn't make much sense. Like, why don't you just use state? It works exactly the same, because even though signals with their observable mechanism allows you to like make sure that components only reconciles based on the signals they observe. If you define that signal locally, of course, like it's a given that every time that signal changes, it should reconcile the component because it's the signal of the component. So in my opinion, there's absolutely no reason to introduce observable state in local component scope of React, because it already has a primitive for doing that, which is called useState or useReducer, which does exactly what it's supposed to do, which is when that state changes, it reconciles the component. So when you see things like, is it called Preact signals? Like they do have a local version of signal. And the reason they have that is because they hack the hell out of React and allows like even this H1 is the only thing that reconciles when the count changes, which is pretty, it's pretty amazing that they were able to do that. But in the scope of a component, there is like the reconciler is faster than, like you don't need to optimize a single component UI. If you have to do that, then your component is too big, is my statement. So I think it's overwhelmingly better to have reconciliation for components, because you just use JavaScript with if statements, switch statements, and you get all the typing, everything out of the box. Any future functionality will just work. So you use reconciliation for the UI, and then you can think about broader state management as something you want to do with observation, because reconciliation works really bad at that. So if we look at a context, the amazing thing about the context scope in a React application is that you can pass them props, right? It might not seem like such a big deal, but it's a huge deal. It means that you can make a piece of state management rely on initialized state. So the state management only instantiates when there's some initialized state available. So in this case, that will be the initial count. In this case, the initial count is like a hard-coded value, probably. But if you think about that being like a user that depends on some asynchronous process and so on and so on, maybe it's ticket, some ticket data that's also asynchronously resolved somewhere else. Being able to like close over that and expose some state management to handle that is a really valuable thing. Yeah, I'm noticing I'm whoa, I'm really unsure how to make these slides. Well, anyways, let me just run through it. I haven't this has only been me dumping things from my brain. But then when you're in a global scope, the only difference from a context scope is that you don't have any external dependencies. Like there's no state that needs to be initialized before this global scope is operational. And then, yeah, so this should be almost some drawings here. So the state of state is that when we have local state scope, so when we have a component defining the state, so you have local component state, and you get to the point where you do a lot of props passing to get that state to the component that actually needs to consume it, we tend to move to a context. Like that's the next step. But when you're in a context, that context can lead to performance issues. And the reason is that the state the context exposes, it doesn't matter what state changes, the context changes. So any consuming component will reconcile regardless of what state actually changes on that context. And even the React compiler fixes this issue. So when we hit a performance issue because our so when the sorry, I got a message. When the context becomes too big, we start splitting up the contexts, right? And we don't do it because it becomes so big that you can't reason about the context. It's just because of performance issues. So you kind of artificially split them up. And then when that just becomes, as I said, artificial, and the hierarchy, like remember, we split it up for performance issues. But now we had to, we split it up because of performance issues. The problem is that a context can't be a sibling. Like they need to be nested. So now you have to choose which piece of this context should be a child of the other. Like it's related state management, but one of them needs to be like nested in the other. And then only the nested one can use the state of the parent, right? So then when that doesn't work, you move to global state management. But global state management is not the silver bullet either. So in global state management, sorry, I haven't actually put down the bullet points here. So let me just talk through it. That's what we're doing in this stream. So using a global state management solution, first of all, it often brings its own paradigm with it. So for example, even though React has use reducer, it really has a big cause of Redux. So Redux introduced reducers, right? I remember back before Redux, nobody used reducers. Like it was nobody used reducers because it was complicated. It was difficult to understand reducers. And you thought of it as like a value transformation tool. But what Redux made like JavaScript developers realize is that reducers is a really good tool to express a pattern, which is like, I don't know what it's called, command pattern or something, where you have this, you close over this state, and then whenever you get like an action into the reducer, you might produce some new state. But that is a paradigm. It's not something that JavaScript developers are, we're kind of used to it now because of Redux. I'm not saying it's a bad paradigm, but it's, when you think about state management, there are many more approachable paradigms. Because here you have the reducers, you have the action creators, and you have thunks. Like, it's scary. What is a freaking thunk? And then with MobX, you have a completely different paradigm. It's not even functional. It's like you create classes. It's object-oriented. You use the mutation API to make changes. So in React, you shouldn't do mutation. In MobX, you should do mutation, and it's just a clashing paradigm. So that it brings its own paradigm is one challenge. Another challenge is that you need to define uninitialized state. And with strict null checking in TypeScript, so it's a typing issue. So uninitialized state is a big problem with type checking, given how much of an itch it gives you. So for example, if you define a user, that user needs to be defined as null because it's an uninitialized user. The problem is that from TypeScript's perspective, that user might always be potentially null. But you know that through 99% of your application, that user will be there because the user, you can't open the app without the user. So now in all your components and also in all your like actions or functions or methods, whatever you want to call them, you also need to create if statements or do a type override that you use. Hey, the user is there. I know it. We couldn't even run this logic if the user wasn't there. So that is a problem. And then you have something we call transient state management. That is like temporary state management. Like you want to instantiate a piece of state management around some dependent state. So for example, if you have a complicated form related to editing a ticket in a project management app, for example, you want the state management to close over an instance of that ticket. And whenever you change the ticket, you want that piece of state management, or like you close it, you want that piece of state management to disappear, right? And what happens in global state stores is that you have to you will reuse the same piece of state management for every ticket you edit. So you have to make sure that you like reset it correctly. So it can very easily like leak into, each other and create bugs. Yeah. So maybe I should like have a summary. The itches summary. So I want to do like a summary of the itches, and then just show a couple of examples of how Impact defines its state management and how it's consumed. And then hopefully kind of it becomes obvious how these itches are resolved. Where we first define like an app store, it's possible to talk about, okay, so in the app store, didn't I? Oh yeah, I did that there. So this app store is provided to the component tree where the user has already been resolved. It's a property that comes to this store through the provider. And it's able to use its global store where we put the user into a signal. Currently, the user cannot change. But if we had a subscription to changes to the user, we would be able to update that user. Maybe I should actually add that. Let's add that. We have room for that. User updates. Subscribe user updates. We should use ID here, and this actually needs to be new notifications or update the okay, update the notifications. Okay, this is going to be a little bit icky because we need to do promise.resolve updated notifications, which is not ideal. This is what we tried to resolve last week. It's like, is there a way to not having to do that? But the signal is a promise of notifications. It's not notifications. So when you set new notifications, you need to set them as a promise, which I was like, and the reason is that we don't know, like you might instantiate the signal as undefined, and then the signal doesn't know that it's a promise signal. So if you would just pass, like technically this would work, but only if the signal knows that it's a promise signal. But it can be instantiated as undefined, which means that it doesn't know that it's a promise signal. And that really bothers me because I think this is going to happen a lot. This is kind of you need such a deep technical understanding of this. And it's something you don't really want to think about. You want to think about these notifications as just lazy notifications, a promise of notifications. So if we did signal.async, are we back at this? Maybe we could flip it around. So, oh, this is interesting. Oh, I didn't think about this. What if we flipped it around? What if we say notifications.async? So we don't make this signal async or even promise. You have a shorthand for setting the value as a promise. That would be possible. That also means that it could have an update function. Okay, something to explore. Anyways, so the point is that there's a lot to talk about here, and hopefully preluded with this itches summary, you kind of see what we're fixing here. Hopefully. But I think this stuff won't make any sense to a lot of people because they just haven't built these kinds of applications, which is fine, right? Yeah, so maybe there should be like, who is this presentation for? I want to have that. Who is this for? Because it really is, it isn't like a general state management solution. It is for a class of applications. Who is this for? Yeah. I want to talk about that. And then I'm going to reflect on this one. I think it's interesting. Because the point is, you would always do promise resolve here. And it's very typically, so this represents that you want to lazily load some data. You don't want this to block anything. But it only represents the initial value, right? And then you want to make sure that but since the initial value represents an actual promise, you have to consume it as a promise, which works really well with the new usehook from React, or you can like actually check the status of the promise, or it's an actual observable promise. But when you want to update it, shouldn't this be 2 parentheses? But when you actually want to update it, like, it's very likely that you want to update it. And when you do, you don't want to manually do promise.resolve. So this is more like set the signal as a promise. Maybe it makes sense. I don't know. Let's see. And then from a consumption standpoint, it's possible to talk about, it's so funny, the meme, like using use. If you've seen that meme, it's amazing how much use it is in React applications. So that would be a funny thing to kind of be a little bit like we're kind of contributing to the meme. So anyways, so here it's possible to talk about that this app component is wrapped by an app provider where we actually get the user. And the state management is initialized, and now you can use this, let's call it App Store provider. We can grab the user. And if anything changes with its user, this will reconcile. Using the using keyword, we have a non-intrusive way to do observation. Think of the stores as a resource that you're using in the sense that you're observing it. Blah, blah, blah. And then we have the notifications where we kind of explain. And now we don't want, like, the user rarely changes, but the notifications might change quite a bit. So here we use the App Store in the notifications app. We consume the notifications, and we don't want to use suspense here. We could use the notifications, which would throw to the suspense boundary. But here we actually want this like notifications indication to show some dots when it's pending. If it's rejected, we want to show this, and when we do have some notifications, we want to map over them and produce the UI for the notifications. And like, if this doesn't click for people, it's just because they haven't experienced these itches. But hopefully it will click when we take these summarized itches and present like very simple examples, because it shouldn't be like a workshop like this is how you use Overmind. Sorry, Impact. Okay, so what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take a small break, and I think I'm gonna just let this cook in the subconscious oven until tomorrow. I've really figured out that sleep is the best way to iterate on things. I always, when I intentionally stop thinking about something and say, no, this is gonna be a sleep process, or this is going to be process, or the next iteration is going to be kickstarted by sleep, I always have new reflections when I wake up the day after, which is really great. Yeah, so we're going to leave it at that, and then I'm going to stop the stream, and we might do another one later, depends on some sessions, where we're going to just continue the refactor of the other app, where we're basically now only like consuming the stores in the UI. We're done refactoring the stores. We're going to consume them in the UI and see how it looks. And then we're going to use that as a reference app for Impact on the front page. We're going to link to these presentation templates for people who are early adopters and wants to share the inspiration or whatever. And then we're going to look at what ChatGPT told me to do and see if we can come up with some other good ways to at least get some attention, right? It's not about convincing people to use this. It's about the people who gets value out of learning about this, reaching them, right? So, yes, that's it for now. Thanks.